Have you ever wondered how someone unlikely can be part of a grand plan? How a person, often despised by society, can be chosen to play an essential role in divine purposes? I am Rahab, and my story is exactly like that. I never imagined that my life could take such a turn. I, a woman who lived in the shadows of Jericho's walls, would become part of something so grand. Every time I look back, I feel the hand of God weaving a story that, to my eyes, seemed unlikely, even impossible. But the ways of the Almighty are mysterious, and what He has in store for us often goes beyond our understanding. I clearly remember the scorching heat of that afternoon. The sun beat down hard against the stones that formed the city's walls, making the air almost unbearable. I watched the city's movements from inside my house, strategically located atop the walls. Behind my facade, I carried a reputation that many knew of, but few dared to speak openly about. People looked at me with judgmental eyes, but they never dared to confront me. I knew what was being said in the corners of Jericho, the stories that circulated about my life. The reputation I carried was a burden many knew of, but few had the courage to mention openly. Yet deep down, I never imagined that one day all those rumors would lose importance. How could I have known that God saw me in a completely different way? That day, something was about to change. As I watched the hustle and bustle on the streets through my window, something unusual caught my attention. Two unfamiliar men were walking among the crowd, but their eyes were different. There was something cautious about them, something that set them apart from the usual travelers I was used to seeing. My heart raced. Instinctively, I knew these men were not there by chance. Who were they? What were they seeking? And why did I feel so drawn to that mystery? Without delay, these men arrived at my door. And without hesitation, I invited them in. I knew that something important was about to happen, something far greater than I could comprehend at that moment. It was as if an invisible force was guiding my steps, leading me to act against all logic and my survival instincts. Why would I do this? Why trust strangers at such a delicate moment? But sometimes, when God calls us, He asks us to take a leap of faith, even when we can't see the path ahead. Little did I know that these men were spies sent by the Israelites, the people whose God was feared by all nations. But why were these men here? And what was I supposed to do? What was about to happen would change not only my life, but the entire course of history. We are here to scout the land. One of them whispered to me, almost like a secret, God has given us this city, and we are preparing for the arrival of our army. My heart leapt. It wasn't fear that took hold of me, but an unexplainable certainty. I knew that the God they spoke of was real. Stories of His great deeds had already reached Jericho, the crossing of the Red Sea, the destruction of powerful kings. Everyone in my city feared the Israelite army, but in that moment, my heart opened to hope. What would I do with this new certainty? Was I willing to risk everything for a greater purpose? Without a second thought, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I took the men to the roof of my house and hid them among the flax stalks that were drying there. I knew the city guards would soon be searching for them, as rumors had already spread through the streets. As expected, it didn't take long before they knocked on my door, demanding answers. The guards arrived hurriedly, their faces stern, demanding answers. Bring out the men who came to your house. We know they are here to spy on the land, they said, their eyes scanning every corner of my home. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that decision. Deceiving the city guards was dangerous, but something stronger inside me knew that this was the right path. I knew I was risking everything. But what about you? What would you do in my place? Would you trust what you felt in your heart, even in the face of danger? With unexpected calmness, I replied, yes, they were here, but they've already left before the city gates closed at nightfall. If you hurry after them now, you can still catch them. The guards, trusting my word, quickly headed towards the city gate, hoping to capture the spies. The city of Jericho was filled with growing tension because everyone knew the Israelite army was nearby, and there was a palpable fear in the air. However, I knew that, contrary to what was expected, The threat didn't come from the spies, but from the invisible hand of God that was about to act. As soon as the guards left, I went up to the roof and approached the hidden men. The sky was beginning to darken, and the shadows of the walls cast over the city as if announcing what was to come. When I reached them, the words came out of my mouth almost as a whisper, but were filled with a conviction I had never felt before. I know that the Lord has given you this land. The fear of you has fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of this land are melting in fear because of you. We've heard how the Lord dried up the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the Amorite kings, completely destroying them. When we heard these things, our hearts melted in fear, and no one has the courage to face you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. I stood before them, a woman of Jericho, but my heart already belonged to the God of Israel. That moment was a cry of faith. And then I made my request, not out of selfishness, but in the hope that my life and the lives of my family would be spared. Now, please swear to me by the Lord that, as I have been kind to you, you will also show kindness to my family. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us. The spies, with solemn expressions, nodded. Our lives for yours, they said. If you don't betray us, when the Lord gives us this land, we will treat you kindly and faithfully. At that moment, everything was decided. My fate, once so uncertain, was now in the hands of the God of Israel. Night had completely fallen, and I led them out of the city, lowering them by a rope through the window of my house, which was built into the city wall. Flee to the mountains, I told them, and hide there for 3 days until the pursuers return. Then go back to your camp. Before they left, they gave me a sign of hope. Tie this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and when we return to take the city, your family will be safe. But remember, every one of yours must stay inside your house. Whoever goes out will be responsible for their own life. With the scarlet cord in my hands, I knew it was not just a signal for the men, but a symbol of redemption, something far greater than I could understand at that moment. I held the scarlet cord tightly, feeling the weight of what it represented. Each knot seemed like a living promise, a thread of hope that connected me to an uncertain future, yet one filled with faith. I carefully placed it in the window, as if that simple act was a covenant with the God of the heavens, a God I was only beginning to know, but who had already transformed my heart in an irreversible way. The days that followed were tense. We knew something was about to happen, but we didn't know when. My house, located on Jericho's walls, offered a strategic view of the city and its surroundings. While the city continued its usual rhythm, with markets operating and people trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy, I knew everything was about to change. My family came to my house as promised. I explained to them the pact I had made with the spies, and although there was some disbelief at first, the fear spreading through Jericho convinced them it was the best thing to do. They stayed with me, under my roof, awaiting the unfolding events. Outside, no one imagined that a simple scarlet cord hanging in my window would seal the fate of our family. Then, the Israelite army arrived. I remember clearly the sound of trumpets echoing across the plains surrounding the city. Jericho's soldiers were tense, ready to defend the walls, but something was different. The Israelites didn't attack immediately. They just marched around the city, in silence except for the sound of the trumpets. Day after day, they repeated the same pattern, one complete circuit around Jericho, then returning to camp. The tension inside the city increased with every lap. Those walls, which had long been our security, now seemed fragile against the invisible power accompanying that people. Everyone knew something great was about to happen. The air was thick with expectation and fear, and in my heart, faith and anxiety were mixed. I didn't know exactly how, but I trusted that God would save me, just as He had promised. Little did I know that that simple piece of scarlet cord would become a symbol of something much greater. But what would happen when the Israelite army finally attacked? And would they keep their promise to spare me? On the seventh day, everything changed. The Israelites marched around the city not once, but 7 times. Each lap, made the ground seem to vibrate. With every trumpet blast, the atmosphere in the city grew darker. People were anxious, murmuring among themselves, unable to understand what would come next. Then suddenly, after the final lap, the sound of the trumpets filled the air with an intensity one had never heard before. And the shout of the Israelite army, like a roar from the heavens, echoed throughout Jericho. It was in that moment I felt it. The earth trembled beneath my feet, and the walls, those gigantic walls that had long seemed unshakable, began to crumble. Stone by stone, they collapsed before my eyes, as if they were made of sand. My house shook, but it remained standing. The scarlet cord still fluttered in the window, and my heart, though racing, was filled with the certainty that the God of Israel had heard me. The fall of Jericho's walls was both terrifying and glorious. The sound of the shouts, the trumpets, and the crumbling stones reverberated through the air, creating an atmosphere of complete transformation. Around me, everything was collapsing and chaos overtook the city. But in the midst of it all, my family and I stood firm, under the protection of a promise that seemed impossible to many. I remember looking out of the window, the scarlet cord still fluttering, a striking contrast against the backdrop of destruction. Dust filled the sky, the voices of lament and terror filled the air, and the Israelite soldiers advanced with strength, taking the city as the Lord had promised. Yet strangely, I did not feel fear. A different kind of peace had settled in my heart, as if I knew that this battle, this moment, was part of a greater plan of which I, a once rejected woman, was now a part. The Israelites advanced relentlessly, and the city was about to be completely overtaken. However, as promised, my house remained intact. I could see that the soldiers noticed the scarlet cord hanging, and unlike the other buildings around, they did not approach. My family, who had once been filled with doubt, now looked at me with tears and surprise in their eyes. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they knew that somehow we were being protected. And then the spies, the very men I had helped, returned to fulfill the promise they had made to me. They came to my door, and when I looked into their eyes, I felt that this was the beginning of something much greater. "Come," one of them said, his voice firm and calm amidst the chaos that still echoed around us. "We are here to fulfill the oath we made to you. Your faith has saved your house." My legs weakened, but I managed to regain my composure. That moment was the realization of something that, just days before, had seemed impossible. As we walked through the destroyed city, I looked around at what remained of Jericho. The faces that once mocked or ignored me were now covered in dust and despair as the city crumbled around them. Yet, amidst all the destruction, my family and I were walking to safety, guided by the power of God's promise. As we left the city, we were brought to the Israelite camp. The soldiers and people of Israel looked at us with curiosity. After all, we were the survivors of Jericho, the city that had been completely delivered into their hands by God Himself. But at the same time, there was an implicit acceptance, a recognition that the same God who had brought down those walls had also extended His mercy to us. It was then that I understood something that would change my life forever. I, a woman despised by Jericho's society, was now among God's chosen people. My life had been transformed, and the faith I had placed in the God of Israel had not only saved me physically, but also included me in a lineage much greater than I could ever have imagined. As we walked through the Israelite camp, the dust of destruction still lingered in the air, but my heart was already at peace. There was something divine in the way everything had happened, as if somehow I had always been part of a much larger plan than my mind could grasp at that moment. The Israelites were a different kind of people, and that soon became clear to me. They were not ruled by kings or tyrants, but by their faith in the God who guided them, the Lord of hosts, the one who had dried up the sea and brought down Jericho's walls with a simple act of His will. There was a sacred reverence in everything they did, and in that environment, I began to see that my former life, with all its darkness, was being left behind. I was just a woman from Jericho, marked by my past. But could God really transform anyone, even the most unlikely? This was a question that lingered in my mind with each passing day. I was beginning to understand that the God of Israel doesn't choose based on the past, but based on what is in the heart and what he can do in our lives. We were welcomed by the community, and I, Rahab, who once lived in the shadows of Jericho, now found myself among a chosen people, a people who followed a greater purpose. There were curious glances, but also welcoming ones. I knew that my past couldn't be ignored, but I also knew that the God of Israel was known for redeeming and transforming hearts. If he had saved me from destruction, it was because he had something new in store for me. The days that followed were filled with adjustment and learning. My hands, once used to tasks and negotiations in Jericho's commerce, now dedicated themselves to learning the customs and laws of this new people. They spoke of a God who not only demanded obedience, but also offered mercy, who led not through human paths of power, but through the way of faith. And it was on this path of faith that I began to discover more about myself. I didn't know what the future held, but I felt that a new life was being born within me, a life guided by something far greater than the judgments and prejudices I had endured in Jericho. Sometime later, I received news that would forever seal my new journey. I was introduced to a man named Salmon, an Israelite of great courage and faith. Somehow, amidst everything I had experienced, God had prepared our paths to cross. Salmon was not just a warrior. He was a man of deep spirituality, someone who understood the value of redemption and new beginnings. He didn't see me as the woman from Jericho, but as someone whom God had called and transformed. We married, and it was the beginning of a new life, a new identity. I, Rahab, was now part of the lineage of God's people. But what I didn't know at that moment was that this new life would have an impact far beyond anything I could imagine. Through my union with Salmon, God was writing a crucial chapter in his story of salvation. Years later, I had a son. His name was Boaz. Little did I know that this boy would become part of a divine link that would connect generations until the arrival of the greatest king of all, Jesus, the Messiah, the one who would come to redeem all of humanity. Looking back, I see that every step I took, every decision made from the moment I hid the spies to the day I tied that scarlet cord in the window was part of a greater plan. God had a purpose, not just to save me, but to include me in the lineage of his son. As the years passed, while raising my son Boaz, the weight of God's grace became increasingly evident. Every time I looked at him, I reflected on how my past of shame and fear had been transformed into a story of hope and redemption. Boaz grew into a man of integrity, someone who deeply understood God's mercy, partly because he carried with him the story of a mother who had been saved from a fate many would consider final. I would tell him, time and time again, how God had brought down the walls of Jericho, not just the physical ones made of stone, but also the invisible walls in my heart. Boaz, I would say, never underestimate God's power to turn the impossible into possible, to change a person's destiny in ways no human could foresee. He would listen intently, absorbing every word. The years went by, and Boaz became a remarkable man among the people of Israel. He was respected, loved, and known for his kindness and faith. And it was during this time that God once again manifested his extraordinary grace, not only in our family, but throughout the nation. But the story of redemption in my family wouldn't end with me. Little did I know that my son Boaz would also unite with another unlikely woman, and together they would forever change the course of Israel's history. Who was she? And what would God do in their lives? It was then that a foreign woman from Moab crossed Boaz's path. Her name was Ruth. Like me, she was not originally part of Israel's people, but it was her faith and loyalty that earned her a place among them. Ruth had lost everything, but her trust in God led her to Bethlehem, where she found not only redemption, but also love, the love of Boaz. When Boaz and Ruth married, a new generation began to emerge. From their union came Obed, who would later be the grandfather of the great King David. And David, from the lineage of Boaz and Ruth, would be the ancestor of the one who would come to redeem the world, Jesus Christ, the Savior. Often, as I watched my grandson Obed playing in the fields, I marveled at the ways of God. Who could have imagined that a woman from Jericho, despised by many, would end up being part of the lineage of the Messiah? With each passing day, my gratitude deepened. My life had not only been spared, it had been completely transformed. I was no longer defined by my past in Jericho, but by what God had done in me and through me. And that's why, today, when I tell my story, I cannot help but ask, how many of us believe that our mistakes or circumstances define us? How many of us think we are beyond redemption, with no chance of being included in God's plan? I am a living testimony that God's power knows no limits. If He can use a woman like me to play a role in His greatest work, He can use any of us. As time passed, I watched the fruits of God's goodness blossom in my family. The story of my life, which began surrounded by Jericho's walls, now expanded far beyond anything I could have ever dreamed. But above all, what filled me with joy was knowing that everything that had happened was not just for my benefit, but for the good of all humanity. I knew that, just as the scarlet cord had saved my household, the Messiah would be the scarlet thread that would save all. It was as if my life, marked by moments of darkness and shame, had been woven together by divine grace into a tapestry that transcended time. Every decision, every act of faith was part of a greater plan that God Himself was crafting. Sometimes I would sit alone, looking at the stars shining in the sky, and think about how the same God who created the universe had cared for me, a common woman, unknown and rejected by many. He not only saw me, but He chose me to be part of something grand, part of the lineage of the Savior Himself. I wondered what would have happened if, on that day in Jericho, I had ignored the spies or lacked the courage to hide them. And then I realized that faith requires risk. Trusting God means stepping into the unknown, believing that He can turn what seems like the end into a new beginning. The descendants of Boaz and Ruth continued to grow, and Israel's story unfolded before my eyes. The God of Israel, the same one who brought down the walls of Jericho, was raising a lineage that would culminate in the King of Kings. And I, Rahab, who had once been just a woman living in the shadows of the walls, was now part of this eternal story. But my greatest joy wasn't in what had happened to me, but in what would happen to all those who, like me, chose to trust in God. Because in the end, my story wasn't just mine. It was a story of faith, transformation, and how God's redemptive power can reach even those who feel farthest from His grace. One day, many years later, while walking through the fields with my grandson Obed, he asked me, "Grandma, do you really believe that God chose you to be part of all this?" I smiled, holding his small hand in mine, and replied, "Yes, Obed. He chose me just as He chooses all of us, not because of who we are, but because of who He is. His grace knows no bounds, and His love never fails." When you grow up knowing this, you understand that anyone, even someone as unlikely as me, can be part of something far greater than they ever imagined. Obed smiled back, and there, in that sunlit field, I felt an indescribable peace. I knew that the future was in good hands, the hands of a God who never fails to keep His promises, and who turns even the most unlikely paths into routes of salvation. My heart was at peace, not because I knew everything that was to come, but because I knew the God who was in control of it all. As the days passed, my life, once marked by shadows and doubts, was now illuminated by the certainty that God had rescued me for a greater purpose. Every time I looked at my family, at Boaz and later at Obed, I felt the confirmation that my faith in the God of Israel had not only changed my story, but also the stories of future generations. Time brought new challenges, as it does in everyone's life. Israel, too, faced its own ups and downs, but God's promise always remained steadfast. I heard the stories of how the people of Israel, despite their failures, always found redemption when they turned back to the Lord. This truth resonated deeply in my heart because I knew what it meant to be rescued when hope seemed lost. I remember one day, when I was older, Boaz asked me about the walls of Jericho. He was a grown man by then, but he still held a curiosity about the stories of faith that had shaped our people. We sat under the shade of an olive tree, and he looked at me with the same attentive eyes he had as a child. "Were you afraid, Mother? When you saw the walls fall, how did you know you would be safe?" I took a deep breath, recalling that unforgettable day. Yes, Boaz, I was afraid, but it was a different kind of fear. It wasn't fear of destruction. It was a reverent fear that comes from knowing something much greater is at work. When the walls fell, I knew that God was doing what he had promised. And at the same time, I knew he would be faithful to the promise he made to me too. The scarlet cord hanging in my window was a sign of faith, but the true sign was in my heart, the certainty that the God of Israel never fails to keep his promises. Boaz nodded, thoughtful. He was a man of deep faith, and the story of Jericho, though distant in time, still fascinated him with how God had acted. "I always wonder," he continued, "why God chooses unlikely people, people whom the world looks down on, yet he decides to use them for his greatest purposes." I smiled, for this was a question I had often asked myself. God sees the heart, Boaz. While men look at appearances, he sees what's inside. That's what I've learned throughout my life. He didn't choose me because I was perfect, but because I was willing to trust him, even when everything seemed lost. Those words came out of me with a clarity that only years of experience with God could bring. As my life progressed, I saw more clearly how God's work wasn't confined to one moment, but to a series of moments where he invites us to trust him. At each stage, he revealed more of his plan, and all that was required from me was the willingness to follow, even when I couldn't see the whole path. Boaz remained silent for a while, absorbing my words. I knew he understood. He, more than anyone, had a heart shaped by the same faith that had transformed me. And it was that faith that led him to Ruth, a foreign woman, just as I had been. Boaz's kindness to Ruth wasn't just a human choice, but an extension of the mercy God had poured out on our family. In the days that followed, I reflected on all of this as I watched my family flourish. I knew that God's grace would continue to guide my descendants, and this certainty gave me a peace that transcended any circumstance. I had found my place in God's plan, not because of my merits, but because of the faith he had placed in my heart. And that faith wouldn't stop with me. It would carry on through the generations until the day the Messiah came into the world. The years passed like a gentle breeze, and with each season, I saw the unfolding of God's plan taking shape before my eyes. Ruth, my daughter-in-law, had truly become a daughter to me, and her son, Obed, was the pride of our family. Deep down, I knew that the story God was writing wasn't just about us. It was about all the people who, like Ruth and I, had been brought from the outside to the inside, from disgrace to grace, from darkness to light. My life in Jericho now felt distant, almost like an old dream, but I never forgot what God had done for me. That scarlet cord, the symbol of my salvation, remained alive in my memory. It wasn't just a physical symbol, but a constant reminder of God's faithfulness, of his ability to use the unlikely to fulfill his purpose. One afternoon, while watching Obed play with other children in the field, I felt a profound peace. I knew that because of God's goodness and mercy, the destiny of my lineage was connected to the destiny of the world. That little boy, running barefoot on the dirt ground, would one day be the grandfather of a great king. Little did he know that his grandson, David, would rule Israel and bring a new era of hope to the people. And little did I know that from David's lineage would come the promised Savior. But what would truly happen with my lineage? How would God continue to fulfill his promises, generation after generation? And how would Boaz, Ruth, and Obed become part of God's divine plan? These questions echoed in my heart as I reflected on God's faithfulness. My heart was filled with joy and gratitude with each thought. I was just an ordinary woman, marked by a past that many would despise, but God had chosen me to be part of something so much greater. Many times, I found myself asking, "Why me, Lord? Why choose someone like me?" And the answer always came in the same way: because my grace is sufficient. This was the lesson I learned repeatedly throughout my life. God doesn't look at who we were, but at who we can become when we surrender our lives to Him. And in doing so, He transforms even the most unlikely stories into victories of redemption. As time went on, Boaz and Ruth built a life that honored the Lord. I watched them with pride, seeing how Boaz, with his generous and faith-filled heart, cared for Ruth, and how Ruth, with her loyalty and love, became a respected figure among the people of Bethlehem. They were living proof that God is not limited by the boundaries we humans place on one another. He goes beyond any barrier, whether of race, culture, or past. He sees the heart, and the story He was writing through us was a story of love and promise. With each generation, the scarlet thread of faith stretched further, connecting the past to the future, linking the unlikely to the impossible. In those quiet moments, whether looking at the vastness of the starry sky or at the simplicity of the fields around us, I reflected on how truly blessed I was. God had not only rescued me physically, but He had saved me spiritually. He had given me a new name, a new identity, and that identity was now intertwined with His work of redemption. Obed grew up, and just like his father, he became a man of faith and integrity. And so, from generation to generation, God's plan continued, bringing life and hope where there had once been despair. I knew that one day, from our lineage, the one who would bring salvation not only to Israel, but to all humanity would be born. And that knowledge was the source of my joy, the reason I could rest in peace, knowing that my story, improbable as it was, had become part of the greatest story of all. The years taught me that faith is a journey that doesn't end with our own story. It continues to unfold through those who come after us, those who inherit not just our name, but also our faith. And so, as I watched Boaz and Ruth build a family centered on God, I felt that every moment of my life, every decision made in faith, was being rewarded in ways I could never have imagined. The Lord had been merciful to me. He not only saved me from the walls of Jericho, but included me in something that would transcend generations. As Obed grew up, his character traits became clear. He was a kind boy with a heart that sought justice and truth. And in his youth, he quickly earned the respect of others, just as Boaz had before him. Yet, my mind often returned to that scarlet cord, the line of hope I had hung in the window so many years before. I never imagined that such a simple gesture of faith would become a symbol of salvation, not just for me, but for countless generations. That cord, which to others seemed just a simple rope, was a reminder that God's grace is present even in the smallest, most everyday things. It was this grace that I saw manifest time and again in my family. The marriage of Boaz and Ruth, the arrival of Obed, and the anticipation that God's promise would continue to be fulfilled through our lineage. It was as if God Himself was guiding us, step by step, toward the fulfillment of His ultimate promise, the coming of the Messiah, who would save not only Israel but the whole world. Time passed, and my health began to decline. I knew my days were drawing to a close, but my heart was at peace. I had seen God's love in action. He had taken a life that seemed lost and turned it into a channel for His grace. Even in the darkest nights of my youth, I could never have imagined the beauty that would emerge from my decision to trust Him. One afternoon, as I sat weakly with Boaz by the door of our home, the sun was setting, casting golden rays over the fields. He looked at me tenderly, and his eyes reflected the wisdom he had gained over the years. "Do you remember," he asked, "how it all began? How God brought us to this point?" I smiled. "I remember every detail, Boaz. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that God never abandons us, even when everything seems to crumble around us. He is faithful." He nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "I see that in everything we are, every part of our story is a reminder that God acts, even in the smallest things." The scarlet thread, I said softly, was only the beginning. It represented something much greater. The blood that redeemed us, that blood continues to flow through our lives. And one day, Boaz, from our lineage, will come the one who will bring ultimate salvation. He looked at me with reverence, as if the weight of those words echoed what God had already revealed to his heart. I know, Mother, God's promise is true, and we are part of it. In that moment, I felt a profound peace. I knew that the work God had started in my life would continue long after I was gone. And that was the beauty of faith. It doesn't end when we leave this world, but continues to flourish in the hearts of those who come after us. The sun set slowly that evening, casting golden and rosy hues over the fields around us. As twilight spread over the land, my heart rested in the certainty that everything God had promised was coming to pass. I knew that my life, once marked by despair within the walls of Jericho, was now a living testimony of God's power to transform the unlikely into an essential part of his eternal plan. The faith that had guided me to that moment now passed on to the next generation, and I knew that the legacy I was leaving for Boaz, Ruth, and Obed was more valuable than any earthly wealth. It was a legacy of unwavering trust in a God who works in mysterious ways, who sees beyond appearances, and who redeems lives that seem lost. As the world continued to turn, the seeds planted by my faith would grow in generations yet to come. One day, from my lineage, a king would be born, David, and through David, the Redeemer of the world, Jesus Christ. And I, a woman who had once been marginalized, now found myself a part of the lineage that would change the course of human history. This is the beauty of God's plan. He uses the most unlikely people to accomplish his greatest works. The scarlet thread, that small symbol of hope hanging from my window, now stretched across generations, connecting lives and stories that would culminate in the greatest of all redemptions, the coming of the Messiah. In those last days, I felt complete. I knew that my story did not end with me. It would continue through the centuries, through the descendants who would come, and through the promises of God, which are eternal. My story began in the shadows of Jericho's walls, but ended as part of a plan that would save humanity. And if God could use a woman like me, what could he do in your life? All he asks for is faith. I closed my eyes, not in sadness, but with a deep peace. My life had been transformed, and now I rested in the hands of the God who never fails, the God who turns walls into paths of salvation. My journey was complete, but the story of the God of Israel would continue. Through me, through Boaz, through Ruth, and through all who, like me, put their trust in him. The scarlet thread that once saved me in Jericho was now woven into the story of the greatest king of all. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and hope, I knew that my life, as improbable as it seemed, had been part of God's divine plan from the very beginning. God never forgets us, and he transforms even the most unlikely stories into testimonies of his love and redemption. And so, the incredible story of Rahab teaches us that no matter how improbable it may seem, God can transform any life and use it for his great purposes. If you've been touched by this story of faith and redemption, don't forget to like this video so that more people can hear this powerful message. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming videos about the great biblical stories that inspire and transform lives. May God's peace be with you, and see you in the next video.